The rehabilitation wing of the Verath Interspecies Advocacy Center had the specific, careful atmosphere of a place that had decided how it wanted to feel, and had constructed that feeling deliberately. The corridors were not clinical in the hard surface, high-light way of medical facilities. They were something softer, the light warmer, the sound more absorbed, the overall effect of a space that was trying with architectural intention to communicate that it was not the last place. Calder Voss had worked in the wing for 8 months. He had come to the posting through a path that his colleagues sometimes described as lateral, a support work background in general residential care, 2 years in a post-conflict resettlement facility on a different station, and a supervisor who had said, when the Verath position opened, that she thought he had something the wing needed, which she had been characteristically imprecise about, and which he had understood to mean something about the way he was present with people more than the specific skills he had. He was not a therapist. He had basic crisis support certification and the training the wing required of all support staff, and a genuine and thorough understanding of what he was not qualified to do, which he considered one of his more useful professional attributes. Room 14 had been the current designation for 3 weeks. He had read the file. He had read it twice, because the first reading had not fully processed, and he had needed the second to let the information actually arrive at the place where information became reality. The black site facility, the 11 months of location work, the conditions the advocacy team had found when they finally got through. He had sat with what the file described for long enough to sit with it properly, because the alternative was to begin the assignment carrying something unprocessed, and Room 14 deserved better than that. She had not spoken since rescue. The file was clear about this. The psychiatric team's notes were extensive and careful and reached, across 14 pages of documented attempts, a consensus that the silence was not neurological or physical but volitional. The specific, total withdrawal of a person who had built a wall and was maintaining it with everything they had, and who had resisted every bridge that every qualified person had extended. The note at the bottom of page 14 in the wing coordinator's handwriting said, "Assigned support presence, non-therapeutic, basic needs, no agenda." He had understood no agenda. He had also understood that understanding it in principle and maintaining it in practice were different competencies, and that the difference would show itself in Room 14, and that the question was not whether he had an agenda, but whether he could be honest about what it was, and whether it was one he could actually set down. He went to Room 14 on his first day of assignment at the meal hour. She was at the window. The room had a window with a view of the station's observation corridor, and she was positioned near it with the specific quality of someone who had found the position and maintained it, not watching the corridor exactly but not turned away from it either. She was Solvari, which meant that her bioluminescent markings were visible at the collarbones and forearms. He had learned to read them as a basic professional skill, the emotional register of Solvari physiology. And what he read in hers was not the distress pattern, and not the neutral pattern, but something he did not have a word for. Something that looked like both, and was perhaps the specific signature of a person who had been maintaining a posture for long enough that it had become its own kind of resting state. He set the meal on the table. He sat in the chair that had been designated as his. He looked at the station's observation corridor through the window for a moment, because it was there, and he was looking for something to start with. The weather system outside the main observation deck has been doing something unusual, he said. The environmental engineers say it's emergent behavior in the atmospheric processors. 2 systems interacting in a way that wasn't in the design specs. He paused. It made a pattern yesterday that looked like something. I couldn't figure out what. It kept changing before I could decide. She did not respond. She did not look at him. The meal sat on the table. He talked about the weather for 11 more minutes, because it was genuinely interesting to him, and because it was something rather than nothing, and then he stopped because he had said what he had to say about it, and continuing past that point would have been filling silence for his own comfort rather than hers, and he had enough self-awareness to know the difference. She ate the meal. He noted this in the session record with the flat factual language, the documentation required, and went home and thought about room 14 in the specific way. He thought about things that he did not yet know what to do with. The sauce schism had begun, as near as Calder could trace its origins, with a disagreement between two members of the meal preparation team about whether a particular fermentation-based Solvari condiment should be prepared fresh daily, or in larger batches, refrigerated over 3 days. This was a culinary question with a clear answer, in the opinion of the head of preparation, which was fresh daily, and a clear answer, in the opinion of his deputy, which was batch production for consistency. And the clarity of both answers was the precise reason the disagreement had been ongoing for 6 weeks without resolution. He had been telling her about this for 4 days, in the way that ongoing institutional sagas lent themselves to daily installment format. She had not responded to any of it. She had eaten her meals with the reliability that had begun on his first day of assignment, and had continued, not because she was improving. The clinical team's notes were careful about not characterizing it as improvement, but because something about the specific quality of his presence had made eating possible in a way it had not been before, which the team was documenting and which Calder did not discuss with her, because making it into data in her presence would have been a kind of betrayal he did not intend. The weather outside the observation deck continued its emergent behavior. He had taken to noting its daily configurations. It had done something he eventually decided looked like a coastline, which had shifted over 4 hours into something he decided looked like a map of a place that did not exist. He told her about this with the genuine interest of someone who found it genuinely interesting, and she sat at the window with the quality of maintained remove that he had stopped interpreting as rejection, and had come to understand as simply what room 14 contained and what he was present in. On the 6th day, he talked about the book he was reading, which was a history of human cartography. The mapping of places before the technology existed to map them accurately, the specific human practice of drawing the known world as fully as possible, and then marking the edges with the notation here be, and whatever the cartographer most feared. He found this interesting in the way he found things interesting, specifically, with the particular quality of attention that wanted to understand what it meant rather than just what it was. What it meant, he had concluded, was that the impulse to map was older than the ability to be accurate, and that the impulse was not about accuracy, but about the specific human discomfort of uncharted edges, the need to put something at the border even if the something was a fear. He told her this. She was at the window. The bioluminescent markings were in their maintained posture. I don't think that's wrong, he said. The impulse, not the fears they drew, those were wrong usually about the specific content. But the impulse to acknowledge that the map ends somewhere, that there are edges you can see from here but can't chart yet. He stopped. I'm probably projecting. It's a history book, not a philosophy text. The sauce schism, on day 9, had escalated to a formal complaint filed by the deputy head of preparation with the wing administrative coordinator, who had read the complaint and responded by suggesting a tasting panel, which both parties had declined on the grounds that a tasting panel would determine a winner rather than establishing the underlying principle, which was the actual disagreement. He told her about this with the resignation of someone who had watched an institutional conflict reach a stage where its original subject had been fully superseded by the conflict itself. The sauce is not really about the sauce anymore, he said. It's about whether there's a correct answer to questions that feel like they should have correct answers, which I think is a more interesting question than the sauce. He looked at the meal tray. The sauce today, for what it's worth, is the fresh preparation. It's better. She ate the sauce. He noted this in the session record without comment. On the 14th day, he was in the middle of the latest development. The formal complaint had generated a counterformal complaint, and the administrative coordinator had requested that both parties submit written statements, which had produced documents that the coordinator had described to a colleague as operatically thorough. And he was relaying this with the genuine amusement of someone for whom the absurdity was real when he became aware that something else was present in what he wanted to say. Underneath the schism and the weather and the cartography book and the 14 days of one-sided conversation. He stopped mid-sentence. He sat with what was present for a moment in the honest way, not managing it, not deciding what to do with it, just recognizing what it was. "I'm sorry," he said. He did not explain it. He did not frame it or qualify it or attach it to anything. He said it in the way that true things got said when you were done managing them. Plainly, because it was true, and because it had been true since he read the file and had been sitting in him while he talked about weather and sauces and maps, and not saying it had started to feel like a particular kind of dishonesty that he was not willing to maintain. He did not wait for a response. He understood there would not be one, or that if there was one it would not arrive in a form he could recognize as such, and he was not saying it for a response. He let it exist in the room the way it existed in the room, and then, because there was still time in the meal hour and the weather outside the observation deck had done something new, he told her about that. She looked at him. It happened at the end of the meal hour, after the weather and after the silence that followed the weather, and it was not accompanied by anything. No shift in the bioluminescent markings, no sound, no movement except the movement of her eyes finding his and staying. He held the look with the stillness of someone who understood that any response except being there would change what it was, and he was there, and she was looking at him, and the room held both of them in the specific quality of a moment that did not need anything added to it. The clinical team, reviewing his session notes, would mark this as first sustained mutual eye contact since rescue. He did not mark it as anything. He went home and sat with it in the way he sat with Room 14 things, which was without conclusion, and then he went to sleep. The words came the following afternoon. He was in the room for the secondary meal when she spoke. Not to him, at least not directly, not with the quality of address, but to the room, in the way that language emerged sometimes before it was ready to be directed, like something that had been sealed finding the pressure differential that gave it an exit. He was still. He was facing the window because he had been watching the weather pattern and he did not turn, because turning would have been acknowledgement in a form that the moment had not asked for. She spoke for a long time. He listened. The words were Silvari, and his translation implant rendered them in the imperfect, approximate way that translation rendered things when the content was specific in its original language, and the translator was working at the edges of its calibration. Not wrong, but partial. The translation of grief that was precise in its original, and could only be approximated in the target language. What came through was enough. What came through was the specific, raw content of what had been done, and what it had taken, and what had been there before, and what was not there now. And it did not have the structure of narrative or recovery. It had the structure of something that had been held under pressure for so long that, when it found a crack, it moved through without organizing itself first. He listened. He did not summarize or reflect back or move toward the clinical language that would have made it into material for a framework. He was present the way you were present when presence was the only thing that was right completely, without an agenda for what the presence was for. When she stopped, the room held the silence of something that had moved through and left the space changed. He sat in it with her. "Thank you," he said finally. Not the clinical thank you, not the therapeutic acknowledgement of disclosure, just the plain thanks of someone who had been trusted with something and understood the weight of it. She did not respond to this. She looked back at the window. Her bioluminescent markings were doing something he did not have a word for, which was becoming a consistent quality of Room 14, things that fell outside his vocabulary that he was learning to sit with anyway. The clinical team formally commended his approach in the third week of the post-silence period. During the case review that had been upgraded from monthly to weekly in light of what the team was calling, in its official documentation, significant rehabilitative progress. They asked him to document the methodology for training purposes. He sat with this request for a long time before writing a short document that described what he had done and noted, at the bottom, that he was not certain methodology was the right word for something that had consisted primarily of not knowing what else to do, and deciding that being present was better than being useful. The team coordinator, reading the document, had sent him a reply that said, "This is the methodology. You've just described it accurately." He had found this both gratifying and confusing, and had filed it under things he was still thinking about. She asked him, in the third week, why he had said it. She asked directly, in the way he had come to understand was her primary register, without the conversational scaffolding that other people use to approach significant questions, without the preamble that signaled important thing incoming. She asked it the way you ask things when you had been thinking about them long enough that the thinking had compressed the question to its essential form. He sat with it for a moment. He gave it the time it deserved. "Because it was true," he said. "And not saying true things when you're sitting with someone who's been through something real felt. It felt like a kind of lying I didn't want to do." She was quiet for a moment. He did not fill the quiet. "Everyone who came before you said things that were true," she said. "Yes," he said. "The diplomat, the liaison, the woman they brought who had been through something similar." She was looking at the window. "They said true things. They said, you are safe. You are among people who will help you. Recovery is possible. These are true things." "Yes," he said. "Those true things had somewhere they were going," she said. "They were true things in service of something else. The next thing. The thing they needed me to move toward." He understood this. He had known it, in the way he knew things in room 14 before he had the language for them. "I was waiting," she said, "for someone to say something true that was not going anywhere." She paused. Something true that just existed in the room. He sat with this. "I'm sorry for what happened to you" was not going anywhere. He had said it without a destination. He had said it because it was true, and because he had stopped being able to sit in the room without saying it. And the not saying had started to feel like dishonesty. And honesty was the thing he had decided was what room 14 required more than anything the briefing had provided. "I heard it and I understood that it wasn't for me to do anything with," she said. "It was just there, in the room." "Yes," he said. She was quiet again for a while. Her bioluminescent markings were doing the thing he was still learning to read, not the distress pattern and not the neutral pattern, something he had filed as hers, a state that belonged specifically to her in this room. "I was not ready to speak to anyone," she said. "I had decided not to. It was the only thing I had that was mine to decide." "Yes," he said. "After you said it," she said, "I was still not ready." She paused. "But the deciding felt different. It felt like it was still mine, but it was mine for a different reason. Before, I was not speaking because speaking was what they wanted. After, I was not speaking because I was not yet ready. That is a different thing." He thought about this. He thought about the difference between a wall maintained against pressure and a door that had not yet been opened because it was not yet time, and how those looked the same from the outside and were different in everything that mattered. "Yes," he said, "that is a different thing." Outside the observation deck, the artificial weather was doing something new. The environmental engineers had sent a note to the wing that morning explaining that the emergent behavior had developed a third system interaction they had not modeled, which was producing a pattern they found both beautiful and somewhat professionally concerning. He had read the note twice because he found it interesting in the specific way the weather pattern had always interested him. He told her about it. He told it in the way he told her things, with the genuine interest of someone who found it genuinely interesting, without managing the telling toward a purpose. She listened in the way she listened now, fully, with the specific quality of someone who had chosen to be present, which was different from the way she had been present before in the way that all chosen things were different from the things that had been maintained by necessity. The wall was not gone. He understood this clearly and without judgment. The wall had been built from something that did not dissolve because someone had said 3 true words and meant them. What had changed was not the wall's existence but its purpose, and the difference between a wall maintained as the only safe thing and a wall that was being examined by its builder for where the door should go was a difference that could not be seen from the outside, but was the most significant structural distinction available. He was not tracking her recovery. He was not measuring the sessions for progress markers or building toward a documented breakthrough or filling out the forms the clinical team needed with the orientation of a person who was constructing a narrative about what was happening in room 14. He was simply there. He had been there for 6 weeks, and he intended to continue being there, and the being there was not a method. It was what was honest, and honesty was what the room required, and he was going to keep doing it for as long as it was what was needed. Outside the window, the weather made its unpredicted pattern. He watched it and found it interesting. She watched it beside him and said, "It looks like something." "Yes," he said. "I can't figure out what, it keeps changing." She was quiet for a moment. "That might be what it is," she said. "Something that keeps changing." He thought about this. He thought it was probably right. "Yes," he said, "that might be what it is."